Beneath Jerusalem's sacred stones, legend claims a secret slept for centuries, power born of faith and guarded by silence. When 9 knights swore their vows as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, they became more than crusaders. They became seekers. Within the ruins of Solomon's temple, rumor spoke of relics, wisdom, and forbidden truths unearthed. Their order grew from devotion to dominion, wielding both sword and secrecy. Yet empires fear what they cannot command. Betrayed by kings, erased by fire, the Templars vanished, but their shadow endured. Somewhere between myth and memory lies the question they left unanswered. What did they find? In the stillness before dawn, when the air of Jerusalem was pale with unrisen light, a young king dreamed. He stood within an endless hall of gold and shadow. Above him, no roof, only a sky that turned like a wheel of fire. A voice came through the brilliance, neither thunder nor whisper. Ask what I shall give you. The dream did not tremble with fear. It glowed with understanding. And Solomon, son of David, did not ask for conquest or vengeance. He asked to discern the heart, to read the pattern that bound heaven and earth. When he awoke, the chamber smelled of cedar and smoke, and the silence felt alive, as though the dream had followed him into daylight. From that morning, his reign moved with a sense of appointment. Israel stood united, its borders stretched from the desert to the sea. Wealth flowed from caravan roads and copper mines. Tribes that had once spoken in rivalry now uttered his name as one. In this climate of promise, Solomon conceived the work that would define his age, a house for the name, the invisible dwelling of the divine. His father had imagined it in exile and battle. Solomon would raise it in peace. It was not ambition that guided him, but geometry, a conviction that numbers themselves could praise God. Far to the north, beyond the coastal ridges, the cedar forests of Lebanon swayed in salt wind. There ruled Hiram, king of Tyre, a Phoenician monarch who read the stars from the decks of his harbors. Between these two kings stretched both friendship and necessity. Hiram's artisans had shaped ships that crossed to Tarshish and stone that outlasted empires. Solomon sent envoys bearing honey, gold dust, and words that would join their legacies. Build with me a temple, and I will build with you remembrance. Thus came to Jerusalem the masons of Tyre, men who measured by the moon, who carved limestone as though it had breath. They brought with them bronze casters, purple cloth, and the mastery of proportion the Levant had inherited from Egypt and Byblos. Through the heat of 10 summers, hammers rang in the hills. The blocks were quarried where no sound of iron would profane the sight. Each stone was shaped in silence before being set in place, as if the temple were assembling itself by divine patience. Cedar beams, floated down from Lebanon, exhaled resinous perfume that mingled with incense. Columns rose like paired trees before the portico, and within their capitals coiled the lilies of the Jordan. Beneath the floor, hidden tunnels carried offerings and light. Above, the roof gleamed with hammered gold, a reflection of the sun's own course. Every measurement mirrored a mystery, the ratio of altar to court, the distance from threshold to veil, all formed according to the pattern Solomon claimed to have seen in the dream. Beyond the labor and wealth, a deeper design was unfolding. The king gathered scribes, mathematicians, and priests to study the principles that govern the work. To them, architecture was revelation made visible. Each line in the plan carried moral weight, each curve an echo of divine speech. They spoke of the cube of the sanctuary as the heart of the universe, of numbers that repeated through nature, the spirals of shells, the intervals of string and breath. For the first time, Israel's worship took shape as mathematics of faith. In that geometry, Solomon found both order and warning. To mismeasure the holy was to unbalance creation itself. In the 7th year of the project, word spread that the foundation stones hummed in certain winds, as though the structure responded to the world around it. Priests dismissed the tale. Builders whispered that the temple was alive. One evening, as the western sky burned red over the mount, Solomon descended into the quarry tunnels to see for himself. Lamps smoked along the walls. The scent of damp stone filled his lungs. At the lowest chamber, he placed his palm upon the central block, the Evenhar Shetia, the stone of foundation. It felt warm, pulsing faintly, as if remembering the hands that shaped it. The king withdrew without a word. From that day, the legends of Solomon's secret began, an understanding of how matter could mirror spirit, how the world itself might be a temple awaiting recognition. Meanwhile, the nation swelled with expectation. Caravans arrived bearing gold from Ophir, spices from Sheba, and copper from Etzion-Geber. Craftsmen from every tribe were called to adorn the sanctuary with cherubim, pomegranates, and lamps. In the courtyards, Levites rehearsed the psalms that would mark the dedication. Through all the noise and splendor, Solomon moved with calm purpose, neither hurried nor proud, as though hearing an inaudible rhythm guiding every decision. He ordered that the Ark of the Covenant be brought from the city of David. It was carried on poles of acacia wood by priests in linen robes, veiled in smoke and trumpet sound, until it rested beneath the twin cherubim of olive wood whose wings touched above the mercy seat. When the final stone was set, 20 years had passed since the vision at Gibeon. The day of dedication drew pilgrims from every border, tribes, foreigners, priests, and merchants, all standing beneath a sky that shimmered with heat. Solomon rose before the altar, dressed in white linen. The court fell silent. He lifted his hands and spoke, not as a king, but as a servant. The heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet turn your face toward this place. As he finished, fire descended from the sky and consumed the offering. The people fell upon their faces. Musicians struck cymbals and harps, and smoke spiraled through the open roof. For an instant, the world and heaven seemed joined. The architecture fulfilled its purpose. Night came over a city transformed. The temple glowed with lamps that burned olive oil behind golden lattices. From the hills, it appeared as a constellation lowered to earth in the royal palace nearby. Solomon stood alone on his balcony, gazing toward the sanctuary. The fire had died, but the air still shimmered. He felt not triumph, but awe, the quiet dread that often follows creation. Somewhere in the wind, he thought he heard the same voice that had once spoken in his dream. The pattern is complete, but beware the builder's pride. He did not answer. Wisdom itself can sound like warning. As years unfolded, prosperity deepened around the temple. Envoys from Egypt and Arabia brought tribute. Sages from distant lands came to test the king's intellect. Yet the center of all remained that golden house upon Mount Moriah. Every festival drew crowds who marveled at its symmetry, its echoing courts, the fragrance of cedar and sacrifice. To them, the temple was the proof of covenant, the visible sign that Israel had reached divine favor. But among the priests, murmurs began. Could any structure contain holiness without being consumed by it? Some said the presence, the Shekinah, was too vast even for Solomon's perfection, and that it lingered only by mercy. There were nights when the king himself doubted. Alone in the upper chambers, he studied the scrolls of measurement and the diagrams of proportion drawn by the Phoenician masters. He saw in them not just beauty, but danger. Numbers that repeated too perfectly, ratios that mirrored celestial orbits. One symbol recurred, a hexagram of interlocked triangles, known among his scholars as the seal. It represented the balance of opposites, fire and water, matter and spirit. To Solomon, it was both key and temptation. If he could master that harmony, he believed, he might glimpse the mind of creation itself. Wisdom, once gift, now became pursuit. Visitors multiplied, alliances formed. Among them were women from foreign courts, daughters of rulers whose languages carried other gods. Their presence filled the palace with music and argument. Temples to Astarte and Chemosh appeared on neighboring hills, small at first, then emboldened by royal indulgence. The nation that had sung one name now sang many. Still, the great temple shone in the sun, its gold untarnished, its rituals intact. But within the king grew a restlessness he could neither name nor silence. It is said that one night, in the final years of his reign, Solomon returned alone to the Holy of Holies. The guards, seeing his face, dared not follow. He crossed the threshold where only priests had walked and knelt before the ark. The chamber was silent except for the flame of a single lamp. He placed his hand upon the stone floor and whispered, "Show me again the pattern." What he saw, no record tells. Some claimed he beheld the same fire that had descended at dedication. Others said the lamp went out and he saw nothing at all. But when he emerged at dawn, the king's hair had whitened and he spoke little for the rest of his life. The Temple of Solomon stood as the summit of Israel's glory, its geometry perfect, its gold uncountable. Yet within that perfection lay the seed of loss. For knowledge and devotion are twins that seldom grow together. The man who sought understanding beyond the measure of men found it, and found also its price. In his wisdom was hidden sorrow. In his temple, the first shadow of exile. The fire that once blessed the altar waited quietly for its time to return. Morning sunlight spilled through the lattice windows of the palace, touching polished ivory and vessels of beaten gold. In those days, the air of Jerusalem seemed thick with prosperity. Caravans arrived daily from Edom and Sheba, their camels ringing with copper bells. Ships from Tyre brought purple dye and fine glass. Singers rehearsed in courtyards where fountains murmured beside lemon trees. The people called it the Age of Peace, and they believed the promise of David had found its fulfillment. Yet peace, when too long sustained, begins to bend toward indulgence. Solomon walked among his builders no longer as a dreamer, but as a sovereign weighed by his own success. The temple stood finished, its courts radiant in the sun, yet his mind refused to rest. He had mastered governance, trade, and alliance. He had built fortresses along the desert routes and docks along the Red Sea. Still, the question remained, the one that had haunted him since the dream in Gibeon. Why had the voice chosen him? Wisdom had answered every inquiry but that. At night, he summoned foreign scholars to his court, Chaldean astrologers, Egyptian priests, and Phoenician metallurgists who whispered of numbers hidden in the constellations. They brought tablets engraved with star maps, fragments of forgotten alphabets, and theories that turned faith into calculation. Some said that Solomon listened not to learn, but to test heaven itself. Others said he sought the lost knowledge of the angels who had fallen. Whatever his intent, the pursuit began to alter the court. Priests who once taught prayer now studied symbols. The sacred merged with the speculative. devotion with design. In the inner gardens stood a great bronze basin, supported by 12 oxen. Its waters reflected the temple's roof and the blue expanse beyond. On certain evenings, Solomon sat beside it with a small circle of scribes, watching the ripples move in slow, geometric rhythm. There he spoke of balance, of light and shadow, masculine and feminine, creation and decay. His words carried both brilliance and unease. "If the Holy of Holies reflects the heavens," he said once, "then we ourselves are the courtyards of God. To know the measure of the temple is to know the measure of the soul." One scribe recorded the saying in a scroll, later sealed and hidden, perhaps because it trembled too near heresy. The foreign envoys admired such eloquence. They returned home, praising the king, whose intellect rivaled their gods. Yet among Israel's elders, a quiet concern took root. The prophet Ahijah spoke openly that the temple had become an idol of its own perfection. When man builds a house for the infinite, he warned, he builds also a prison for himself. The warning went unheeded. Solomon's vision had expanded beyond covenant. He now imagined that through knowledge one might approach the power of creation itself. His alliances multiplied, and with them his wives. Daughters of Moab, Egypt, Sidon, and Ammon filled the royal quarters. Embassies made flesh. They brought musicians, servants, and household gods carved from wood and alabaster. At first these were curiosities, tolerated for diplomacy's sake. Soon small shrines appeared on the terraces, an image of Astarte beside the lilies of Judah, an incense altar bearing a sun disk, an idol of bronze set discreetly behind a screen. The temple on Mount Moriah still drew its daily offerings, but on the hills surrounding the city, other fires began to burn. The people saw their king offering sacrifices not of rebellion, but of curiosity and confusion, spread faster than scandal. Among the high priests, debate turned to division. Some insisted that Solomon's wisdom would reconcile the nations, that by honoring every god he revealed the unity behind them all. Others saw betrayal, the dissolving of the covenant that had once bound desert wanderers into a single people. When the smoke from rival altars began to drift across the same sky, faith itself lost clarity. The unity that had built the temple began to crack, almost silently, like gold cooling on an anvil. One evening, the king walked through the great hall of pillars, where the light of torches wavered against gilded cedar. He paused before the inner door of the sanctuary and pressed his hand to the bronze knob, but did not enter. Behind that veil rested the ark, two cherubim facing each other over a void that symbolized presence. The silence beyond the door seemed heavier than prayer. He whispered, "You gave me wisdom, but wisdom is a fire. It consumes its keeper." No answer came, only the distant echo of singers rehearsing for the next feast. He turned away before the echo faded. Years passed. The splendor remained, but its light cooled. Tax collectors demanded gold to maintain the vast works. Conscripted laborers grumbled in the quarries their fathers had once left in triumph. In the north, tribes whispered of rebellion. Even Hiram of Tyre, once brother in faith and trade, complained that shipments were unpaid. The temple still stood immaculate, yet within its treasury the silver grew thin. Prosperity, like incense, had drifted upward and vanished. The prophets of the court spoke in gentler tones, fearful of the crown. Only one dared to confront the king directly, a young seer named Azariah. He came unbidden to the palace and declared, "The Lord gave you wisdom to build a house for his name, but you have built also chambers for your own." Guards moved to silence him, Yet Solomon raised a hand. "And what would you have me do?" he asked. The prophet replied, "Remember that knowledge without obedience is smoke." The words lingered like the scent of burnt offering. The seer departed, unpunished but unwelcome. That night, Solomon dreamt again of the hall without roof. The voice spoke, yet this time it was distant, as though muffled by stone. "You have sought to number the stars, but you have forgotten to count your days." He reached out, but the light receded, and in its place came darkness layered with sound, a murmuring like distant waves. From that noise emerged faint outlines of cities ruined and altars broken. When he awoke, the lamps had burned out. He ordered new oil, but even flames seemed to tremble. The decline unfolded quietly. Trade routes faltered, old alliances eroded, and the once proud unity of the tribes began to fray into suspicion. Yet the temple endured, serene and unchanging, as if indifferent to the turmoil beyond its walls. To foreign travelers, it appeared eternal. To those within, it had become a mirror reflecting absence. Solomon, grown old, spent his final years writing proverbs that veiled confession in wisdom. "Vanity of vanities," one fragment reads, "all is vapor." Some claim these were the last words he spoke before withdrawing to his chamber for the final time. After his death, the kingdom convulsed. Rehoboam, his son by an Ammonite queen, ascended the throne, inheriting wealth but not restraint. When the northern tribes petitioned for mercy from heavy taxes, he answered with scorn, "My father chastised you with whips. I will chastise you with scorpions." The nations split as though along an invisible fault long prepared. Jeroboam rose in the north, raising golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The united Israel became two kingdoms, and the temple, once center of the world, stood like a heart beating for only half a body. In Jerusalem, priests continued their rites, but the air felt different. The Shekinah, that luminous sense of presence, was said to flicker like a lamp running low. Pilgrims still came, but fewer each season. Rumors spread that the ark itself had grown silent, that its wings no longer resonated when hymns were sung. Some whispered that angels had withdrawn their guardianship. Others believed the sacred fire had retreated into the inner stone, waiting for purity to return. The building remained magnificent, but its glow belonged to memory. Outside the city walls, workmen dismantled Solomon's other shrines. Statues of foreign gods lay shattered in the dust. A few loyal servants buried fragments in the valley of Hinnom to hide their shame. The once wise king had left behind both revelation and ruin, knowledge that lifted men toward heaven, and curiosity that dragged them toward the earth. In later generations, when the temple burned and its treasures vanished, chroniclers would say that the loss began not with Babylon, but with thought. The moment a man tried to measure eternity, yet even ruin carried continuity. Within the priestly families, descended from Zadok, fragments of Solomon's designs survived. Drawings on copper, notes on proportion, hints of an inner chamber beneath the inner chamber. These secrets would reappear centuries later in exile visions and mystic schools. The wisdom that once illuminated Jerusalem refused extinction. It changed form like fire finding new fuel. Though the temple's gold would melt, its pattern remained, a blueprint written into human longing. When the first storms of invasion gathered on the horizon, a few scribes sealed tablets within the wall foundations. One carried a verse scratched hastily in Phoenician script. "The house is dust, but the pattern is eternal." Long after the torches of conquerors turned the sanctuary into smoke, that sentence endured, faint but legible. It is all that survives of a civilization that tried to capture heaven in stone and found instead its reflection in ashes. So ended the reign of Solomon the Wise, the dreamer who built the architecture of heaven and discovered that wisdom, once born into the world, cannot be contained. It grows restless, seeking new vessels. The temple stood, but the unity it symbolized had already passed into legend. What remained was a mystery, half-remembered, waiting for another age to unearth it beneath the dust of its own ambition. When Solomon's body was laid in the royal tomb, the sound of mourning filled Jerusalem like wind through broken gates. The city still glittered, but beneath its gold, the foundations had begun to shift. The king's wisdom had built an empire. His curiosity had divided it. The same mind that raised the temple of God had taught men to question the covenant that sanctified it. And so, when his son Rehoboam ascended the throne, the kingdom inherited not only wealth, but fracture. Rehoboam was young, impetuous, and born to abundance. He wore Solomon's crown as though it were a victory, not a warning. The elders of Israel came before him in the temple courtyard, asking that he lighten the burdens his father had laid, the forced labor, the endless tribute that had sustained the building of shrines and palaces. He turned from the grey-bearded counselors who urged mercy and listened instead to the laughter of his companions. "Say to them," they advised, "my little finger is thicker than my father's loins." When Rehoboam spoke those words, arrogance hardened into fate. 10 tribes turned away that very day, and with them went the dream of a united Israel. In the north, Jeroboam raised his own altar, setting golden calves at Bethel and Dan. He claimed that these represented the unseen power that had delivered their fathers from Egypt. But the echo of Sinai's blasphemy was unmistakable. 2 kingdoms now stood where one had been, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, each convinced that heaven favored its own priests. The temple on Mount Moriah still shone, yet it no longer reflected a single people's faith. From that fracture, the slow undoing of the covenant began. Generations passed. Kings rose and fell like waves, some righteous, others corrupt. In Judah, the descendants of Solomon guarded the temple as the last proof of legitimacy. In Israel, prophets thundered in wilderness towns, accusing the northern rulers of idolatry and injustice. They spoke of the covenant as a living fire, capable of warmth but also of judgment. Elijah called down flame from heaven. Amos warned that the day of the Lord would bring darkness, not light. Yet both kingdoms continued their rituals, mistaking ceremony for repentance. Far from the palaces and altars, the people grew weary. Droughts came, trade declined, and Assyria's armies pressed westward like a gathering tide. The prophets said these calamities were not chance but consequence, that Israel had forgotten the pattern laid in Solomon's day, the harmony between wisdom and obedience. When Samaria fell in 722 BC, the survivors were scattered among foreign lands, their songs carried into exile. Only Judah remained, clutching the temple keys as if they could hold back history. In Jerusalem, the priests redoubled their devotion. They cleansed the courts, repaired the bronze sea, and read from scrolls rediscovered in forgotten chambers. King Hezekiah, seeking to restore purity, ordered the destruction of the hilltop shrines that had multiplied during his ancestors' reigns. He reformed worship, reopened the temple, and called the people to celebrate Passover once more in unity. For a moment, it seemed the fire of faith would reignite. Yet reform born of fear seldom outlives the threat that inspires it. Beyond the borders, empires shifted. Assyria waned, Babylon ascended. To the prophets, these powers were not mere nations, but instruments in the hand of the divine. Isaiah spoke of a storm that would sweep through the lands, sparing only what was rooted in righteousness. Jeremiah, younger and more desolate, warned that even the temple itself would not save them. Do not trust in these deceptive words. The temple of the Lord, he cried at the gate, has this house, which bears my name, become a den of thieves. His voice echoed against the stone pillars, drowned by the clatter of sacrifices and commerce. Few listened. Faith had become habit, ritual, currency. Among the priests, however, unease stirred. They knew that the Ark of the Covenant, the heart of the sanctuary, had not been seen for years. Some whispered that it had been hidden during the wars with Egypt. Others claimed it was removed in secret when the Babylonians first threatened the border. A small circle of Levites, descendants of Zadok, guarded this silence as if it were part of the ritual itself. To reveal the Ark's absence would invite panic. To deny it would invite guilt. And so, they kept both truths folded together in secrecy. In the year 605 BC, Babylon's armies reached Jerusalem. The city fell not in fire, but in tribute. Vessels of gold were taken from the temple and carried to the east as trophies. King Jehoiakim swore allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar, believing compromise would preserve the holy place. But each generation that bowed to empire bent a little further from covenant. The prophets warned again. Ezekiel among the exiles, seeing visions of the divine chariot departing from the temple, rising above the Mount of Olives like a bird escaping its cage. If the presence of God could leave his house, what then remained sacred? A decade later, the final blow came. Babylon returned under siege, and this time mercy was forgotten. The city burned for 7 days. Priests threw themselves upon the altars. Scribes tried to save scrolls by hiding them in clay jars within the walls. The Ark, if it still existed, vanished into the smoke. Some said it was carried through a secret tunnel beneath the temple to the valley of Kidron. Others that it was taken by angels beyond the reach of men. When the flames subsided, only the retaining stones of the platform remained. The house of the Lord was dust, and Judah became a nation of captives. The exile began with disbelief. By the rivers of Babylon, singers hung their harps upon willow trees, unable to voice the psalms of Zion. The prophet's warnings now felt like ghosts haunting every dream. Yet, in the stillness of captivity, another kind of vision emerged. Ezekiel, seated among the exiles, saw a new temple, not of gold or cedar, but of light and measure. Its gates faced the cardinal winds. Its proportions reflected cosmic law. To him, this was not nostalgia, but revelation. The pattern of heaven itself, the architecture of what had been lost. If Solomon's temple had embodied faith in stone, Ezekiel's described faith as geometry, an invisible design that could be rebuilt wherever hearts aligned with its harmony. Through such visions, Israel began to preserve what neither fire nor exile could destroy. Scribes recopied the ancient scrolls, adding annotations born of suffering. They spoke of wisdom not as possession, but as presence, a voice that could follow them into foreign lands. In Babylon, scholars gathered to interpret dreams and symbols, laying the groundwork for traditions that would one day blossom into mysticism. Out of loss came a new understanding, that the true temple was not a building, but the order written into creation. Still, legends persisted of hidden things. Among the exiles, travelers claimed to have met priests who carried fragments of sacred treasure wrapped in linen, or who spoke of vaults sealed beneath the ruins of Jerusalem. Some said the Ark had been buried under Mount Moriah by men loyal to the old ways. Others that its blueprints had been etched onto thin tablets of copper and hidden in a cave near the Dead Sea. These whispers kept hope alive. the belief that divine wisdom could never be erased, only concealed. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed the captives to return, the people came back to a city silent as a grave. The Temple Mount was a mound of ash, yet among the rubble, the foundation stone, the even Hashatia, remained intact, blackened but unbroken. Around it, they began again. Zerubbabel led the work. Prophets like Haggai and Zechariah urged the builders forward. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, they proclaimed. But when the new sanctuary stood finished, smaller and plainer, there was no descending fire, no cloud of presence. The Shekinah had not returned. The temple was complete, but the voice that once filled it was silent. In that silence grew yearning, and yearning became speculation. The elders spoke of the lost ark as the soul of Israel. Scribes debated whether it had been hidden or ascended. The mystics of the exile reimagined it as something inward, a chamber within the heart. Slowly, theology turned into mystery. Patterns drawn by Ezekiel became the language of a secret geometry. His vision of radiant wheels gave rise to symbols of angelic order. The loss of the physical temple created an invisible one, vast and indestructible. That unseen sanctuary would one day inspire seekers far beyond Judea, men who believed that to rebuild Solomon's temple was to rebuild the connection between heaven and earth. Centuries later, when travelers from the west and north would kneel upon the same mount, they would not see only ruins. They would see a question written in stone. What was lost beneath these foundations? The exiles of Babylon had no answer, but they left behind a whisper that endured through time, that somewhere beneath the ashes, under the layers of conquest and prayer, the pattern still waited to be found. The wind that swept over Mount Moriah carried the scent of dust and ashes. Decades had passed since Babylon's armies shattered the first temple, but the memory of flame still haunted every stone. When the exiles returned under Cyrus's decree, they expected deliverance to feel like triumph. Instead, it felt like amnesia. The city lay flattened, its gates consumed, its walls broken into heaps. Only the old foundation remained, half buried, marking where heaven had once seemed to touch the earth. Zerubbabel, heir of David's line, stood before the ruins and wept. Around him gathered the elders who had seen Solomon's house in their youth. They remembered the fire descending, the trumpet calls, the gold that had caught the sun like a mirror of the divine. The new generation knew only fragments of those stories, passed in exile through psalms and laments. Now, standing upon the blackened hill, both old and young faced the same emptiness. Faith, they realized, must begin again, not with proof, but with memory. From Persia came timber and masons, gifts of the empire that had become their unlikely patron. The king's edict allowed them to rebuild, but permission was not presence. Work began under guarded watch, slow and uncertain. When the first stones were laid, a cry rose that mingled joy with grief. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah moved among the builders, urging them to persevere, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. Yet every evening, as the sun died beyond the western ridge, workers turned to look for the fire that once fell from the heavens. It did not come. The second temple rose modestly from the rubble, smaller than its predecessor, devoid of cedar from Lebanon or gold from Ophir. Its inner sanctum stood empty. The Ark of the Covenant was gone. In its place, the high priest entered each year to burn incense before a bare stone. The people still prayed, still sang psalms of ascent, but the rituals felt hollow. The Shekinah, the luminous cloud that had once filled Solomon's courts, did not descend. Some whispered that Israel had returned home, but God had remained in exile. In that absence, a new kind of faith began to form. The priests guarded ceremony, but the scribes turned to interpretation. The word became their temple. Lines of scripture, copied by trembling hands, replaced pillars of cedar. Every scroll was treated as a sanctuary, every letter a brick of the divine house. From this reverence grew the first stirrings of mystic thought, the belief that the universe itself was text and that the holy could be rebuilt through language. Beyond the temple walls, other voices carried different visions. The prophets who had returned from Babylon spoke of cosmic order, of angels and living wheels, of fire that moved like thought. Their words inspired a generation that sought meaning, not in sacrifice, but in pattern. Among them arose Ezra the scribe, who gathered the scattered scrolls and shaped them into a canon. He saw the failure of kings and the silence of heaven, and he understood. The covenant must now live within understanding. Through study and remembrance, Israel would rebuild the invisible temple. Still, nostalgia clung to the mount. Old men spoke of vaults beneath the sanctuary, sealed chambers where priests before the siege had hidden treasures of Solomon's age. Rumors of copper scrolls, jeweled lamps, and geometric tablets passed through the markets. The priests neither confirmed nor denied them. When asked about the ark, they answered with silence, or said that the Lord himself had taken it. The absence of proof became a kind of holiness. The unseen drew more reverence than the seen. As centuries turned, the Second Temple became a paradox, a building of devotion standing on a foundation of loss. Pilgrims came from distant provinces, bringing offerings and petitions, yet many left uneasy, sensing that the heart of the place no longer beat. The rituals were precise, but the air held no voice. Still, hope persisted that the divine fire would one day return. Scribes began recording dreams and portents that foretold a third descent of glory. Every generation waited for it, and every generation buried its longing a little deeper. Under Persian rule, Jerusalem knew fragile peace. When Alexander's armies arrived, the city opened its gates rather than face destruction. Hellenic influence crept in quietly, language first, then ideas. Greek philosophers debated with Hebrew scholars in shaded courtyards. Some saw this mingling as corruption, others as revelation. The notion that geometry mirrored the order of creation resonated with those who remembered Ezekiel's vision. Slowly, the dream of Solomon's architecture returned, not as memory of walls, but as metaphor for the cosmos. During these years, certain priests began collecting teachings that spoke of the temple as symbol rather than structure. They wrote of 7 heavens, of angelic orders arranged like steps to the divine. They claimed that Solomon's builders had known these mysteries, that the temple's proportions were reflections of celestial law. Though such writings were not public, they survived in fragments passed from master to disciple. Out of exile's despair, sacred science was born. Not all welcomed these ideas. The conservative elders saw danger in turning worship into speculation. They feared that secret knowledge would repeat the sins of Solomon, the arrogance that once led the wise astray. Yet the hunger for meaning could not be suppressed. In hidden rooms of the temple, scholars traced patterns on wax, tablets, studying the intervals between letters of holy text, convinced that within them lay the measure of the divine. What had begun as grief became inquiry. Inquiry became tradition. Meanwhile, power shifted once again. The Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria fought over Judea, like gamblers dividing spoils. Each conqueror claimed to protect the temple, each taxed it. Greek language filled the markets, and statues of unseen gods appeared on neighboring hills. When Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the sanctuary, setting up his own altar within its courts, outrage erupted. The Maccabees rose in revolt, purging foreign idols and rededicating the house with renewed flame. For a moment, it seemed the fire had returned at last. The Feast of Lights was born from that victory, a remembrance that oil meant for one night burned for 8. Yet even this miracle could not disguise the deeper absence. The ark was still missing. The Holy of Holies still stood empty. Through all these upheavals, the legend of what lay beneath endured. Pilgrims spoke of subterranean passages running from the temple to the spring of Gihon, of sealed doors and hidden vaults. Priests denied such tales, but they persisted. Some claimed that the prophet Jeremiah had hidden the sacred vessels before the Babylonian siege, burying them in a cavern to await the day of restoration. Others said the treasures were guarded by angels, sealed by geometry that only the righteous could read. The stories varied, but their heart was constant. Somewhere, the lost knowledge of Solomon remained intact, waiting to be uncovered. By the 1st century before Christ, Jerusalem stood at the crossroads of empire again. Rome ruled, and Herod, eager for legacy, began a vast renovation of the Second Temple. He expanded its courts, lined its walls with marble, and turned the humble sanctuary into one of the marvels of the ancient world. Yet the grandeur was political, not spiritual. The inner chamber remained bare, guarded by silence. The priests performed their duties, but prophets had long ceased to speak. Religion had become ceremony, revelation a rumor. Still, among certain sects, the Essenes who dwelled near the Dead Sea, the mystics who withdrew into desert caves, the old fire flickered. They copied ancient scrolls and wrote new ones, describing a temple not made by hands, a house of light existing in the heavens. In their writings, Solomon's wisdom was transformed into prophecy. The architecture of heaven had never been destroyed, they said. It waited to descend upon a purified world. These communities preserved the idea that sacred geometry, once embodied in stone, now lived in vision and meditation. Their scrolls would one day resurface in caves of dry rock, testifying that knowledge could outlast empire. So the centuries turned, temple upon temple, ruin upon ruin, wisdom buried and reborn. Israel had returned, but not as before. The house of God stood again, yet without the voice that once filled its courts. The people prayed toward a silence, believing that silence itself was holy. Beneath their feet, the old foundations held secrets they could no longer name. The ark was gone, the fire withdrawn, but the pattern remained, etched into memory, awaiting its rediscovery by those who would come after. What was lost in exile had become legend, and legend, as always, was the seed of mystery. The morning sun rose over the white stones of Jerusalem, turning the Temple Mount into a mirror of light. To the weary eyes of those who had survived conquest and exile, the city seemed reborn. The sanctuary rebuilt by Zerubbabel stood quiet, smaller than the first, yet within its courtyards, the rhythm of sacrifice had resumed. Incense drifted upward, mingling with the cry of doves, and for the first time in generations, pilgrims ascended the hill, with hope instead of lament. But beneath that renewal stirred a longing the rebuilding could not satisfy. The glory of Solomon's day, the fire, the voice, the presence had not returned. What had once been seen now had to be imagined. In that absence, imagination became theology. The priests maintained ritual precision, Yet the philosophers of Judea began to ask questions the altar could not answer. Why had God's presence departed? Could holiness dwell beyond sacrifice? Was the temple itself a symbol rather than a dwelling? Such questions birthed schools of thought that blended scripture, exile vision, and foreign philosophy. Wisdom became not a possession of the priesthood, but a current flowing through poets, scribes, and wanderers who sought to decipher creation itself. Under Persian rule, these thinkers spoke softly. Under the Greeks, they began to write. The empire of Alexander had scattered ideas as freely as it scattered armies. From Athens came notions of form and harmony. From Babylon, the calculations of the stars. Judean scholars who once guarded the law now studied the heavens, seeing in constellations the same order that structured the commandments. They began to read the Torah not only as history, but as architecture, as if each word were a stone in the cosmic temple Ezekiel had described. This fusion of revelation and reason would shape centuries to come. In the hills near the Dead Sea, a small brotherhood withdrew from the city to preserve purity. They called themselves the Yahad, the community. To the world, they were the Essenes, ascetics who bathed before sunrise and copied scrolls by lamplight. Their writings spoke of hidden knowledge, of angels who taught men the measure of the firmament, of divine blueprints buried beneath the visible temple. They believed that the sanctuary in Jerusalem had been defiled by politics and blood, and that the true temple awaited revelation in the wilderness. Each member lived as a living stone in that unseen house. Their hymns, written in ink of soot and honey, described geometry as prayer. Through circles, you have measured the heavens. Through letters, you have built the world. Fragments of their scrolls would one day survive where their community did not. But already, their influence reached beyond their caves. Travelers who visited their settlements returned with stories of a library that contained the secrets of Solomon's builders, diagrams of sacred proportions, writings on the movement of stars, maps of the angelic orders. Whether these were fact or myth mattered less than their effect. The rebirth of an ancient conviction that knowledge and holiness were one. Meanwhile, the temple itself changed. When Herod the Great took the throne under Roman favor, he sought to immortalize his reign through architecture. He expanded the sanctuary until its courts could hold nations. The outer walls rose like cliffs of marble. Colonnades stretched into the horizon. Pilgrims who climbed the steps beheld a structure so vast that even the memory of Solomon's house seemed small. Yet within, the Holy of Holies remained empty. The ark was gone, the silence intact. The temple had become monument rather than mystery, its perfection a mask for loss. Among the priests, this void inspired unease. They performed their duties with outward zeal, but inwardly, many feared that the heart of worship had turned to stone. Scholars responded in two directions. Some tightened ritual law, others turned inward, seeking wisdom in allegory. The Book of Proverbs, once attributed to Solomon, became the seed of philosophy. Wisdom has built her house, it declared. She has hewn her 7 pillars. To later interpreters, those pillars were the 7 heavens, the architecture of creation itself. The temple became metaphor, earthly reflection of a pattern that extended beyond stars. Such metaphors found fertile soil in Alexandria, where Jewish scholars translated scripture into Greek and mingled with philosophers who spoke of the divine as light clothed in thought. There, sages like Philo wrote of the temple as a symbol of the human soul, the outer court as senses, the sanctuary as mind. the inner chamber as spirit. In his writings, Solomon's wisdom evolved from governance into metaphysics. Geometry, music, and virtue were facets of the same truth, the harmony of the one expressed through multiplicity. Through such synthesis, the faith of Exile became the philosophy of eternity. Yet not all embraced this widening vision. The zealots of Jerusalem saw in it only corruption. To them, every foreign word was desecration, every metaphor blasphemy. The temple, they insisted, was not symbol, but fortress, the dwelling place of a jealous God who would one day smite the oppressor. Their fervor would eventually ignite revolt. But in the generation before that flame, mystics continued their quiet work, threading Greek logic and Hebrew prophecy into a single fabric of meaning. One of these mystics was a priest named Mattathiah, remembered only through a few surviving lines. He wrote of hearing the echo of the divine voice not in the sanctuary, but in the spaces between its stones. When silence hums, he said, wisdom speaks. Such paradox marked the beginning of esotericism within Judaism, the conviction that revelation hides itself in plain sight. The temple's emptiness became an invitation to seek the hidden presence within creation. This belief would later migrate into the hearts of men who built new temples from memory. Beyond Judea, the Roman world pressed closer. Roads and legions brought order, but also unease. Empires demanded taxes, and taxes built marble, not faith. When Pompey entered the Holy of Holies in 63 BC and found it bare, he laughed and left. To him, the emptiness proved the folly of Israel's God. To the priests, it was a humiliation too deep to name. Yet from that moment, a strange strength took root. The idea that divinity needs no image, no throne, no proof. The void itself became sacred. In this paradox lay the seed of later mystery religions, of Gnostic visions, of all who would seek the invisible in the silence of form. As years turned, the line between philosopher and mystic blurred. Scholars mapped the heavens not merely to predict seasons, but to mirror the temple's layout. Healers invoked Solomon's name in prayers of protection, tracing hexagrams on parchment as symbols of divine order. The seal of Solomon, once royal emblem, became sign of balance between light and darkness. In it, later generations would see the reconciliation of opposites, the same pattern that had haunted the wise king's dreams. Even as Rome tightened its grasp, Jerusalem remained magnet to pilgrims, scholars, and visionaries. In the markets, Greek merchants sold papyrus marked with sacred diagrams. In synagogues, scribes debated the nature of wisdom. Was it the law, the stars, or the spirit that moved through both? The temple overlooked it all, silent and immaculate, its golden doors reflecting a world that no longer understood its own center. Yet beneath those stones, according to rumor, ancient corridors still wound downward into darkness. Builders spoke of sealed chambers left untouched since Solomon's time. Some said that within them lay the Ark, or the tablets, or perhaps writings so perilous that even priests feared their rediscovery. The truth was unknown, and perhaps that ignorance itself was part of the design. When Herod's masons rebuilt the platform, they unearthed stones carved with symbols older than the kingdom itself. Spirals, interlocked triangles, the faint outlines of a star within a circle. They reburied them quietly, judging them relics of a forgotten cult. Yet to those who noticed, the discovery confirmed what the mystics had long whispered, that the temple's foundation rested upon knowledge preceding all nations, wisdom that reached back to the dawn of civilization. If the Ark had vanished, its spirit had not. It lived in pattern, proportion, and the human longing to understand. As the century closed, Travelers from distant lands, Greeks, Egyptians, Persians, stood before the shining courts of the Second Temple and marveled. None could guess that within a generation it would fall again. Yet even as political fate drew its circle of fire, another current was gathering. The idea that the temple was no longer stone at all, but the human body, the world, and the word. In this convergence of prophecy and philosophy lay the transition from Israel's wisdom to the mysteries that would later cross into other faiths. Out of exile had come vision, out of silence, speech, and out of the second house of God would emerge a new way of building, one not measured in cubits, but in revelation. When Rome spread its shadow across Judea, the world seemed permanent again. Roads cut through deserts, aqueducts crossed valleys, marble gleamed on every horizon. Yet beneath the imperial order, unrest moved like heat beneath a crust of sand. In the courtyards of the Second Temple, merchants shouted above the bleating of sacrificial lambs, coins clattered against the paving stones, and priests argued over purity and law. The house rebuilt after exile had become the heart of a city ruled by foreigners, a monument balanced between devotion and defiance, and in its silence, people heard both promise and warning. Herod's masterpiece towered above them all. From a distance, it seemed a mountain of white and gold, each stone cut so precisely that the seams vanished in sunlight. Pilgrims climbed its long staircases, trembling with awe, whispering that this was the glory of Israel restored. Yet to many, the perfection felt hollow. The Holy of Holies remained an empty chamber, its ark long vanished, its sacred fire replaced by oil lamps tended in ritual habit. The priests served Rome as much as God. The sacrifices had become commerce. For the poor who waited in the outer courts, the temple no longer signified mercy. It embodied distance. Among them arose teachers who spoke of a different kingdom, one not made with hands. Some taught in parables, others in riddles that wove together prophecy and memory. They spoke of the temple as body, as spirit, as pattern. In their words, the sanctuary began to dissolve into symbol, the dwelling of God no longer confined to walls, but hidden within the human heart. For the establishment, this idea was heresy. For those who hungered for meaning, it felt like revelation. The age of the mystery faiths had begun. The Essenes, by the Dead Sea, watched these upheavals with detachment. In their stone libraries, they copied scrolls that mapped the heavens in geometric precision, interpreting every constellation as a letter in the divine alphabet. They believed the Second Temple was doomed, that a cosmic war between light and darkness had already begun. In their hymns, the architecture of heaven replaced the architecture of Jerusalem. Build within us the sanctuary of the Spirit, one fragment reads, for the earthly courts have been defiled. When Roman legions later marched on the city, those words would seem prophecy fulfilled. The revolt came in 66 AD, a fire lit by desperation. Zealots seized the temple, proclaiming themselves guardians of God's house. For 4 years, blood flowed through its courtyards, Jews fighting Jews, while Rome prepared its vengeance. When Titus's armies breached the walls in 70, the final act unfolded like ritual inversion. The inner courts, once filled with incense, filled instead with smoke and screams. Flames rose higher than the colonnades, devouring cedar beams and gilded panels. Witnesses said molten gold ran through the cracks of the pavement like rivers of sunlight. The temple that had survived exile, conquest, and reform fell within a single night. As dawn came, the mount was a ruin of ash. The Romans carried away menorahs and trumpets to adorn their triumph in the capital. But no soldier found the ark, no relic that could prove possession of holiness. The conquerors left believing they had ended a nation's faith. In truth, they had only transformed it. For the people of Israel, the destruction became a second revelation, that God's dwelling was not a place, but persistence itself. In the decades that followed, survivors scattered across the empire. Some fled to Alexandria, others to Antioch, Rome, and the Western Isles. They carried with them scrolls salvaged from burning houses, fragments of text that blended law, vision, and secret reflection. Out of these fragments grew schools of hidden interpretation. The mystics of the diaspora spoke of the Merkava, the divine chariot seen by Ezekiel as the true temple in motion, a structure of light that could be entered through meditation. They studied letters as architecture, seeing in every word the blueprint of creation. Through exile, the priesthood of sacrifice became the priesthood of understanding. Meanwhile, in the Greek-speaking world, philosophers and converts began to see the temple through another lens. The Logos, the divine word, was described as both builder and building, the invisible order that gave form to matter. The wisdom of Solomon, once confined to royal legend, reappeared as metaphor for the eternal architect. Early Christian writers drew from these currents, declaring that the temple was not lost but fulfilled, the body itself a sanctuary, the heart a holy of holies. In their faith, the fire returned, not upon altars, but upon souls. The architecture of heaven had moved inside man. Yet beneath doctrine, legends persisted. Some claimed that priests loyal to the Old Covenant had hidden sacred objects before the siege. Lamps, tablets, scrolls of forbidden knowledge. Others whispered that the Templum Domini, as the Romans renamed the ruins, concealed tunnels leading to chambers untouched by flame. In Alexandria, scholars rumored that copies of Solomon's Book of Measurements had survived, describing ratios by which the universe could be rebuilt. These tales, half faith and half longing, ensured that the temple lived on as mystery long after its walls were dust. In time, the mount became a palimpsest of conquerors. A Roman shrine to Jupiter rose where the Ark once stood. Later, a Byzantine church. Later still, under Islam, the Dome of the Rock. Each new faith claimed to restore what the last had defiled. Each inscribed its own geometry upon the same sacred platform. And yet, beneath the marble and mosaics, the original foundation stones endured, older than empire, bearing the scars of fire. Pilgrims from every creed felt their presence even if they could not name it, a tremor of memory, the sense that something vast still slept below. For the sages of later centuries, this layering itself became revelation. The temple, they said, was never meant to stand forever. It was a mirror in which humanity could see its own hunger for permanence. When it burned, that hunger turned inward and became the search for the divine pattern in mind and matter alike. Thus began the age of mystical architecture, the belief that by understanding proportion, harmony, and light, one could touch the same truth Solomon glimpsed in his dream. In the libraries of Alexandria and the academies of Babylon, mathematicians and theologians began to draw the same diagrams, circles within squares, stars of 6 and 8 points, lines marking the ascent from earth to heaven. These figures would travel across centuries, carried by scholars, mystics, and builders who spoke different tongues, but shared the same vision, that geometry was the handwriting of God. The temple had fallen, but its proportions had become eternal. When the first Christian pilgrims arrived centuries later, they did not find ruins. They found a symbol, They walked among the scattered stones and spoke of resurrection, of a temple not made by hands. For them, Jerusalem was no longer a city, but a state of the soul. For the rabbis who gathered in exile, the same ruins became the proof of endurance. Prayer replaced sacrifice, study replaced offering, and every home became a sanctuary. Out of destruction grew two great traditions, both tracing their lineage to the same silence that had once filled the Holy of Holies. The fire that had fallen in Solomon's time would not return as flame. It would return as thought, spreading through philosophies, encoded in symbols, whispered through ages. In secret schools, builders and visionaries preserved the belief that the divine could be measured, that heaven had left its ratios in stone. They would look to the east, to the mountain where gold once gleamed, and imagine that beneath its layers of conquest and prayer, the lost wisdom of the first architect still waited. The fall of the Second Temple was not an ending. It was the opening of a hidden gate, and through that gate, centuries later, other seekers would walk, men bearing crosses instead of scrolls, armor instead of linen, yet drawn by the same mystery. They would come to the mount not to destroy or rebuild, but to uncover. For in the ruins of Jerusalem, they would hear the echo of a voice that had never truly left. The pattern is eternal. Seek and you will find. Twilight over Jerusalem softened the edges of stone and gold. Smoke from altar lamps drifted above the temple mount like breath, dissolving into the darkening sky. For 2 centuries, that platform had been a stage for empires and prayers, its silence layered with memory. Solomon's fire, Herod's marble, the caliph's domes, the crusaders' hymns. Now, in the early 12th century, the same wind carried a new rhythm, the measured tread of armored boots, the whisper of Latin psalms. Where prophets once dreamed and kings once judged, the order of the temple had begun its vigil. Years of secrecy had already passed since the knights first settled upon that sacred plateau. What they uncovered in the deep chambers beneath their quarters remained unspoken, yet something within their bearing revealed transformation. Pilgrims saw it in their stillness. Chroniclers noted it in their eyes. Men who had glimpsed a truth too immense for language. When they finally emerged from obscurity, they no longer resembled mere soldiers. They carried themselves as initiates of an invisible order, guardians of a covenant revived. Support from Rome confirmed their ascent. Papal bulls granted immunity from taxes and kings alike. Their red cross became seal of divine sanction. Europe, weary of endless wars and craving absolution, embraced them as heroes of both sword and soul. Commanderies multiplied along rivers and frontiers, built with the same symmetry that defined their house on the mount. Each fortress was a reflection of Jerusalem, a square for the world, a circle for heaven, a meeting of geometry and grace. Stone replaced parchment as the order's scripture. Across those frontiers, whispers followed their growth. Merchants spoke of scrolls discovered under the temple, written in a language neither Greek nor Latin. Monks claimed the knights studied under the guidance of Eastern mystics who had served Solomon himself. Others whispered of relics, an alabaster jar, a golden rod, fragments of a tablet inscribed with stars. None could prove such rumors, yet they persisted because they explained what ordinary reason could not. How an order of 9 impoverished men had become a power rivaling monarchs. In their fortresses, austerity ruled. Brothers ate from wooden bowls, wore coarse linen beneath armor, and slept in communal halls under rule of silence. Yet discipline bred precision. Their architecture revealed devotion to proportion, their rituals to secrecy. Each initiation began with a question asked in darkness. Whom do you serve? Only one answer was permitted: the temple. What that word signified beyond brick and mortar remained the mystery that bound them. Jerusalem's light eventually dimmed. Muslim forces under Zengi and later Saladin pressed upon the Latin kingdoms like an incoming tide. One city after another fell, and with them, illusions of permanence. Yet even defeat served the Order's legend. Templar courage in battle bordered on resignation, as if each loss fulfilled prophecy rather than contradicted it. Chroniclers wrote that when Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, the knights departed without despair. They left as custodians of a secret too enduring for conquest. The physical mount could be lost. The pattern could not. Cyprus became refuge, Acre their last bastion. From these outposts, the Order continued its mission, no longer guardians of one city, but of an idea. Fortresses rose along the Mediterranean like sentinels of invisible geometry. Their commanderies in France and England turned from barracks into banks, from sanctuaries into archives. Beneath cloisters, vaults were carved to store gold, relics, and knowledge. Each chamber followed the same ratios found in Solomon's blueprints: 1:1, 1:3, 1:5, the harmony of divine measure. Across Europe, architects who trained under Templar patronage carried fragments of that hidden wisdom into new cathedrals. In their arches and rose windows appeared echoes of the temple's proportions. At Chartres, sunlight filtered through colored glass, in patterns resembling constellations over Jerusalem. At Tomar in Portugal, a circular sanctuary mirrored the dome of the rock. Builders could not explain their designs, only that they felt right, as if guided by a memory older than themselves. The Templars had found a way to translate mystery into mathematics. Within the Order's highest ranks, study of ancient science replaced study of war. Brothers gathered manuscripts rescued from Arab scholars, treatises on geometry, astronomy, and healing. They learned of numbers as language of creation, of architecture as imitation of the cosmos. These discoveries, far from heresy, were seen as recovery of the wisdom once entrusted to Solomon. To know proportion was to honor the Creator's intent. To build in harmony was to participate in divine order. Europe admired their brilliance, yet feared their independence. No king could command them. No pope could truly contain them. Their lands stretched from the green valleys of Scotland to the sand-colored walls of Acre, a network linked by allegiance to an ideal rather than a throne. Even their seal hinted at dual purpose, two riders sharing one horse, poverty masking power, humility concealing insight. The church saw devotion, philosophers saw allegory, rivals saw danger. Legends deepened that mystery. Some chroniclers claimed the knights had discovered not the Ark, but the knowledge it once carried, a sacred geometry capable of bridging heaven and earth. Others spoke of a Book of the Builder, an ancient manuscript said to hold formulas for constructing the architecture of God. Whether such relics existed mattered less than what they symbolized. The conviction that faith could be expressed not only through prayer, but through proportion, light, and stone. While scholars debated doctrine, the Order continued to grow. Their ships crossed the western seas, their caravans traversed deserts. In every land, they sought the same alignment, places where earth and sky met in balance. Chapels were built on hilltops where sunrise entered through precise openings at equinox, casting light upon the cross engraved in floor. Travelers who witnessed such moments swore the air itself vibrated. In those instants, heaven seemed measurable. pilgrims returned home carrying fragments of this wonder. They spoke of the knights as custodians of harmony, defenders not merely of cities, but of knowledge too luminous to perish. Their fame became doctrine, their silence scripture. Europe bowed to their reputation, even as envy stirred beneath admiration. Kings borrowed fortunes they could never repay. Bishops relied on their charity while resenting their autonomy. By the 13th century, the temple had become both pillar and mirror of Christendom's ambition. Beneath outward piety, their philosophy matured into something subtler. For the knights, God was architect, the universe his cathedral. Every stone laid in perfect proportion echoed the first act of creation. In their eyes, warfare defended order, not territory. To die in battle was to become part of the pattern, a life measured and complete. Such conviction made them unstoppable, but also inscrutable to those who saw only swords. In Acre, their last great fortress, silence held the same sanctity as in Solomon's halls. Wind blew across the battlements carrying salt and prayer. Records speak of rituals performed at midnight, hymns whispered in geometry, chants timed to the movement of stars. Even in retreat, the order kept rhythm with the heavens. To their minds, defeat was temporary, knowledge eternal. Centuries later, historians would argue whether the Templars ever found anything beneath the Temple Mount. Perhaps the vaults yielded nothing but stone and air. Yet the true discovery lay in the transformation itself. Soldiers turned scholars, guardians turned builders, a brotherhood that inherited the vision of Solomon through discipline and silence. Their genius was not invention, but remembrance, the art of translating lost holiness into living form. From the ruins of Jerusalem, a new temple had arisen, not of gold or cedar, but of ideals. Its stones were courage, geometry, and faith. Its foundation, the conviction that divine order can be built by human hands. And though its walls would one day fall under flame and accusation, the design they guarded would endure, hidden in architecture, echoed in symbols, whispered in prayer. The pattern Solomon once dreamed had found new builders upon the same sacred ground. Night winds from the Mediterranean carried salt through the narrow streets of Acre. Waves broke against the harbour walls, rattling the chains of anchored ships. Inside the fortress that overlooked the water, the brothers of the temple gathered for prayer. Torches lined the refectory walls, their smoke curling upward in slow, steady spirals. No feast followed, no speech interrupted the quiet. Only the rhythm of breath, the scrape of armor against stone, the echo of discipline remained. 2 centuries had passed since their first vows in Jerusalem, yet the order had never forgotten what silence could guard. From these fortresses along the coast, the Templars ruled an empire of service that stretched across continents. Pilgrims traveling from Burgundy to Acre could lodge in their commanderies without fear of theft or hunger. Letters of credit carried the red seal of the temple, allowing gold to cross borders unseen. Caravans on land, fleets at sea, and fortresses of perfect geometry formed the skeleton of their domain. The design was more than organization. It was devotion translated into structure. In every ledger and arch, the same invisible pattern pulsed, the echo of the mount where their story began. Europe saw them as both monks and merchants, saints and financiers. Kings borrowed heavily, paying interest that remained unspoken but never forgotten. Princes stored crowns in Templar vaults, knowing no thief could pierce their walls. The order's wealth was vast yet elusive, land, tithes, and trade rather than coin. To common people, their prosperity seemed miraculous. To rulers, it was unnerving. Independence from both throne and altar gave them a freedom no other institution possessed. Obedience to God had made them untouchable. Within the order's inner circle, learning replaced conquest. Knights who once rode to war now studied in scriptoria, filled with manuscripts copied from Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew originals. Geometry, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy were taught beside scripture. Their libraries became the crossroads of civilizations, preserving texts that might otherwise have vanished in Crusader fire. Each diagram of stars, each measured arc, reaffirmed their oldest creed. Divine wisdom is proportion, and knowledge is worship. Architecture remained their highest prayer. In the hills of France, England, and Iberia, chapels rose that mirrored the mount's sacred ratios. Circular naves symbolized eternity. Windows traced the angles of celestial motion. When sunlight entered through those stained glass petals at equinox, it fell upon the floor with precision that seemed guided by heaven itself. Pilgrims who knelt in such places spoke of music, heard without sound. The Templars called it resonance, the harmony between creation and faith. Not all knowledge could be spoken. Certain manuscripts, copied in secret script, contained diagrams said to originate from Jerusalem. They described a language of shapes, triangles joined to circles, lines intersecting like rays of light. To initiates, these were not abstractions, but maps of divine law. They believed the Temple Mount had been built upon these principles, that Solomon's masons encoded heaven's blueprint in stone. The brothers who studied such texts spoke of it only among themselves. Silence was protection, revelation, responsibility. As their fame grew, myths thickened like mist around them. Troubadours sang of a chalice hidden in their vaults, a vessel that contained not wine but understanding. Scholars whispered of a head worshipped in secret, a symbol of the spirit beyond form. In monasteries, rival orders accused them of heresy. In taverns, poets turned them into magicians. Yet those who met the knights found men of restraint, humble in manner and spare in speech. Whatever power they carried, it did not manifest in spectacle. Their authority was quieter than rumor, steadier than doubt. Relations with kings remained delicate. In France, the order financed wars and built bridges. In England, they advised monarchs and stored royal treasure. Gratitude rarely outlived debt. Royal courts, always balancing reverence against resentment, began to imagine that the temple owed allegiance not to Christendom, but to itself. The accusation was unspoken, but persistent, that the knights held another covenant, one older than papal blessing, one that stretched back to the mount and the secrets beneath its stones. Jerusalem had long been lost, yet the order never ceased to orient itself toward that memory. Pilgrims visiting their European commanderies noticed that chapels aligned with the sunrise over the eastern hills, as though the knights still faced the holy city each dawn. In their rituals, certain gestures echoed ancient priestly forms, the lifting of hands, the tracing of invisible geometry before the altar. None of this appeared contrary to doctrine, yet those who witnessed it sensed continuity deeper than creed. The Templars served God, but the God they envisioned seemed vast enough to contain the cosmos itself. Saladin's conquest of the Levant had scattered the Latin kingdoms, but the order survived where all others crumbled. On the island of Cyprus, they built harbours and courts of law. In Portugal, they became architects of exploration, designing ships that sailed farther than Crusader dreams. Even in retreat, their reach expanded. When pilgrims spoke of them, they no longer mentioned swords. They spoke of maps, of stars, of builders who understood the breath of stone. War had forged their legend, peace refined it. Inside their halls, secrecy deepened with time. New initiates learned codes of gesture and number that replaced words. To ask directly was forbidden, to understand was enough. Among the upper ranks, philosophy replaced politics. The old quest for the Holy Land turned inward, the search for divine order within the human soul. Some chroniclers later claimed that the Templars practiced a hidden rite drawn from Solomon's wisdom, a meditation upon light passing through geometry, meant to awaken spiritual sight. Whether invention or memory, such descriptions capture what their silence concealed, a belief that knowledge itself could sanctify. By the 13th century, the temple had become more than a military order. It was a civilization within civilization. Cathedrals stood on its endowments, universities drew from its libraries, and kings consulted its envoys before treaties or war. Yet power carries its own gravity. Envy gathered around their sanctity as storm clouds around a mountain. In France, King Philip the Fair watched their wealth flow through his lands yet remain beyond his grasp. He owed them more than he could repay, and debt breeds conspiracy faster than heresy. Even in that precarious height, the brothers continued their rhythm of prayer and construction. Fortresses rose like hymns, precise in measure, serene in purpose. They believed the geometry of the temple to be eternal, immune to politics. Perhaps that faith made them blind to danger. In their archives lay the pattern of heaven. In royal courts, men whispered of treason. History was preparing its reversal. Before the storm, silence held a strange serenity. At Acre, the last outpost in the Holy Land, a final mass was sung as dawn painted the sea red. Those who witnessed it said the sound was unlike any chant heard before, part lament, part prophecy. When the fortress fell, survivors carried the order's relics to Europe. Scrolls wrapped in linen, sealed chests, and a handful of builders who remembered how to read the stones. Their departure closed the Crusades, but opened a new chapter of legend. From those ashes rose a truth that history could not bury. The Knights had failed to hold Jerusalem, yet they had preserved its essence. The temple was no longer a building. It was a method, a way of aligning matter with spirit. Their architecture, their codes, their discipline, all echoed the dream that began in Solomon's night vision. The belief that divine order can be built by mortal hands. That idea, more enduring than any fortress, would survive long after their banners fell. Centuries rolled like dust across forgotten altars. Empires shifted, tongues changed, and the echo of the fallen temple lingered beneath new foundations. What had been Jerusalem became a palimpsest of faiths, each era writing its creed upon the same sacred hill, each convinced it had reclaimed the favor once promised to Solomon. Fires of memory smoldered beneath layers of conquest, waiting for the next generation to uncover them. Out of the deserts of Arabia, a new creed rose, swift as sunrise. Armies carried its revelation westward, banners rippling with words of unity. In 638, Caliph Umar entered the city with humility, barefoot upon its stones, ensuring the sanctuaries of others were not profaned. Where Roman shrines had stood empty, he ordered a house of prayer aligned toward Mecca. The Temple Mount, silent since the days of Herod, echoed again with invocation. Centuries later, a dome of gold crowned that platform, its interior inscribed with verses declaring that God has no equal. Beneath the stone canopy, the ancient rock lay exposed, the navel of the world, the same surface once kissed by fire in Solomon's age. Pilgrims of three faiths now approached the mount with differing tongues, yet similar awe. Jews prayed along its western wall. Christians walked the Via Dolorosa to the sepulchre. Muslims circled the Rock of Ascension. Each believed holiness survived through remembrance. The city endured through paradox, ruined yet radiant, conquered yet unbowed. To the Latin West, distant and divided, Jerusalem became myth itself, a promise of redemption and proof of loss. Across Europe, monasteries multiplied like constellations in stone. Kings knelt before bishops, bishops before popes. Yet every ruler felt the restlessness of prophecy. Rumors from the east of holy relics, of sacred cities in foreign hands, stirred longing and pride. Pilgrims returning from distant shores brought stories of the holy city glimmering under Islamic banners. In their telling, sorrow turned to outrage. What had been an ancient grief became a living call to arms. Pope Urban II stood before the crowd at Clermont in 1095 and spoke words that cut across continents. Deus vult, God wills it. Those two syllables turned penance into battle cry. Princes pledged their swords, peasants their lives. Families sold land, monasteries melted chalices, and a tide of humanity moved eastward, believing the journey itself would wash away sin. From the forests of Gaul to the plains of Hungary, an army of pilgrims advanced beneath the sign of the cross. Months later, the host reached the Levant, hungry, sunburned, and half-mad with faith. When they sighted Jerusalem, it shimmered through heat haze, its walls bright as brass. 40 days of siege followed. Arrows darkened the sky, ladders splintered, stones flew like meteors. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders breached the gates, streets filled with cries of victory and horror alike. Chronicles describe men wading through blood at the Temple Mount, where the dome of the rock became church once more. Priests sang hymns amid ruin, believing heaven itself had sanctioned their conquest. No voice answered them but the wind. Godfrey of Bouillon refused a crown of gold, calling himself advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. His humility suited a city of ghosts. Around him, new rulers divided spoils and sanctities. The dome became Templum Domini, the temple of the Lord. The Al-Aqsa Mosque turned palace and treasury. Yet beneath those vaulted halls, the ground still concealed the bones of older sanctuaries. Herodian chambers, Hasmonean tunnels, the shadow of Solomon's courts. Every step across the platform pressed against centuries of buried prayer. Peace followed in fragile measure. Pilgrims returned in steady streams, their numbers swelling with every tale of victory. Roads from Jaffa to Jerusalem filled with carts, relic traders, and penitents walking barefoot under the Levantine sun. Outlaws followed them, Bedouin raiders, bandits from the hills, remnants of defeated armies. Few who set out reached the holy sites unharmed. Amid this chaos, necessity birthed guardians. 9 knights, all of noble blood, yet weary of vanity, took vows before the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Their leader, Hugues de Payan, promised to protect travelers on the road to the holy city. They pledged poverty, chastity, and obedience, living by the sword but not for it. The king granted them lodging within the Al-Aqsa complex, atop the mount itself. From that moment, they were known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Years passed before Europe even learned their name. In the meantime, they patrolled deserts, escorted pilgrims, and according to rumor, excavated beneath their own quarters. Workmen in the city spoke of tunnels reopened, of vaults discovered where air smelled of antiquity. Some said the knights sought relics. Others believed they sought knowledge. Their secrecy, born of discipline, bred fascination. A decade of obscurity would later be remembered as the 9 years of silence, a gestation before revelation. Across the sea, fascination hardened into reverence. When the Council of Troy convened in 1129, Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux endorsed the order, calling its members new kind of knights, fierce to the foe, gentle to the faithful. Papal recognition followed swiftly. Privileges once reserved for monasteries extended to warriors. The temple became both army and abbey, answerable to none but the Pope himself. Charters, donations, and estates poured in. From the vineyards of Burgundy to the ports of Portugal, castles and farms were marked by their red cross. Pilgrims entrusted them with funds, redeemable upon arrival in the Holy Land, letters of credit that passed safely through brigands and borders. Through necessity, they had invented a new alchemy, transforming faith into currency. For the first time since Rome, wealth moved freely across Europe, bound by a network of monasteries with swords. Jerusalem watched their ascendance with unease. Warriors who owned no land commanded fortresses, garrisons, and treasuries. Their influence stretched from the Levantine deserts to the Pyrenees. Yet within their mount residence, austerity remained. Meals were plain, halls unadorned, prayers whispered at dawn and dusk. To outsiders, the discipline looked saintly. To rivals, impenetrable. Silence, once necessity, had become armor. Meanwhile, the holy city itself teetered between splendor and decay. Markets thrived with trade from east and west, Damascus steel beside Venetian glass. Churches rose upon ruins, mosques stood unharmed under truce. Faiths coexisted uneasily within sight of each other's altars. In that mingled air of reverence and rivalry, the Templars forged their reputation. They were warriors who bowed neither to kings nor bishops, protectors of pilgrims and perhaps of secrets. What they discovered beneath their headquarters remained unsaid, yet their order's emblem, a pair of riders upon one horse, hinted at duality. Poverty above, mystery below. Legends multiplied. Pilgrims whispered of relics lifted from dust, of manuscripts written in ancient Hebrew or Phoenician, of a chamber sealed since Solomon's reign. Such tales crossed the Mediterranean and reached cathedrals of France, where masons carved the double triangle of the seal into stone facades. Whether inspired by rumor or revelation, Gothic architecture began to echo the proportions once sacred on the Mount. In flying buttress and rose window, in hidden ratios and points of light, scholars later glimpsed continuity, the geometry of heaven resurrected in European stone. Rival orders looked upon the temple with envy. Hospitallers tended the sick and the poor, but their black mantles lacked the mystique of the white. Bishops bristled at a fraternity immune to their courts. Yet kings continued to borrow from them, and pilgrims to bless them. Their wealth grew vast, their authority unassailable. In less than a century, the quiet guardians of a single road had become the architects of Christendom's ambition. Night upon the Mount remained their truest ritual. Torches flickered along the colonnades where Solomon once dreamed. Beneath those arches, chants echoed low, merging Latin prayer with silence. Stars wheeled overhead in perfect correspondence with the geometry carved into the floors below. Every line, every proportion, whispered the same conviction, that order itself was divine, that heaven and earth could meet again through design. Faith for these knights was not conquest alone. It was alignment, sword and compass, courage and number, obedience and vision, all joined under a single vow to guard what must not yet be revealed. As dawn bled into the desert sky, their banners caught the first light, crimson upon white, and Jerusalem's stones shimmered as they had in Solomon's age. The pattern endured. The names changed. History would call that century holy, though its holiness was written as much in blood as in devotion. Behind the pageantry of kings and crusades, a quieter miracle unfolded. Within the mount that had witnessed every triumph and ruin, a new brotherhood was shaping the next chapter of the temple's legend. They had come to protect travelers and left as keepers of the world's most enduring mystery. Faith had raised armies before, but never an order whose true strength was silence. Dawn spilled across the stones of the Temple Mount like molten glass. Bells from distant chapels mingled with the muezzin's call, and for a brief moment the city breathed in harmony. High above the valley of Hinnom, banners of white and crimson rippled in the breeze. Within the former Al-Aqsa complex, the Knights of the Temple prepared for another day beneath the same sun that had once burned upon Solomon's roof. Silence, discipline, and ritual bound them more tightly than steel. Beneath those arches, corridors sloped downward into shadow. Dust swirled where picks had struck stone centuries earlier. Workmen whispered that the Templars dug not for treasure, but for remembrance, seeking the bones of prophecy buried below. Some swore that carved pillars and sealed chambers had been found. Others claimed the knights guarded entrances no outsider ever saw. Whatever truth hid in the depths of the mount, its secrecy became the breath of legend. Across Europe, their names spread faster than merchants could sail. Pilgrims spoke of warrior monks who lived without wives or gold, yet wielded influence that reached from the Jordan to the Pyrenees. In Burgundy and Champagne, abbots compared their discipline to that of angels. When Bernard of Clairvaux praised their dual nature, monks and soldiers fused into one purpose. His words carried the force of revelation. Papal sanction soon followed, lifting them above all earthly authority. Poverty became privilege, obedience, independence. Commanderies rose along pilgrimage roads, built with the same precision that marked their quarters in Jerusalem. Each fortress mirrored the next, round chapels echoing the Holy Sepulchre, refectories aligned to sunrise, foundations measured in sacred ratios. Stone itself became scripture. In their geometry, observers sensed hidden purpose, a belief that order, when perfected, could summon divinity. Across these holdings, wealth gathered without ostentation. Pilgrims entrusted savings to the temple before departing for the east, retrieving them on arrival through coded receipts. Money crossed mountains and seas without moving a single coin. Through faith alone, the knights had invented a system more secure than any kingdom's treasury. To many, it seemed a miracle. To kings, a temptation. Jerusalem remained their heart. Nights on the mount brought cool winds scented with olive and myrrh. Torches burned in the courtyards, casting long shadows across walls older than memory. Within the central hall, brothers prayed before dawn, heads bowed beneath flickering light. Few spoke. Those who had labored in the tunnels carried a quiet unlike any other, an inward certainty, as though they had glimpsed something that language could not contain. Rumors rippled through the holy city. Traders whispered that the knights had found relics of Solomon's age, vessels of gold, scrolls of forgotten letters, even fragments of the Ark itself. Others swore they had uncovered diagrams etched into stone, depicting circles, triangles, and constellations. None could prove it. The order neither confirmed nor denied. Silence guarded their reputation more fiercely than armor. Beyond the walls, Europe listened. Monarchs endowed estates to the temple. Widows willed fortunes to its safekeeping. Across the continent, their emblem, a red cross on white, marked granaries, vineyards, and ships. Ports in Marseille, La Rochelle, and Lisbon filled with Templar sails, carrying grain, pilgrims, and secrets alike. To sailors, the cross promised protection. To merchants, reliability. Only a few guessed at the spiritual ambition beneath the discipline, the belief that to serve order was to serve God's hidden architecture. Not all regarded them with reverence. Rivals among the Hospitallers envied their privilege. Bishops resented their immunity from local law. Yet every accusation dissolved against the proof of their usefulness. They secured the pilgrim roads, funded crusades, and garrisoned the fortresses that held Christendom's frontier. Their courage in battle bordered on fatalism, each knight ready to die, as if death itself were initiation into a greater mystery. Whispers of deeper rites persisted. Initiates, it was said, swore vows in candle-lit chambers, blindfolded until the final prayer. The ceremony's meaning eluded even those who reported it. Some described a symbolic death and rebirth. Others spoke of oaths taken in a language older than Latin. Whether invention or truth, these stories made the Order's secrecy irresistible. Faith thrives on mystery, and the Templars embodied both. Across the seas, their influence shaped the very face of devotion. Cathedrals rising in France bore the same numerical harmony found in their eastern strongholds. At Chartres, light poured through stained glass in patterns that mirrored the constellations. At Tomar in Portugal, circular sanctuaries echoed the mount's sacred proportions. To masons who laid the stones, geometry was prayer. To the initiated, it was revelation. Through their architecture, the Templars turned the silence of Jerusalem into music of proportion and light. Kings borrowed gold and called them brothers until debts grew too deep to repay. Popes relied on their fleets and messengers. Even enemies acknowledged their incorruptible order. Yet every gain drew envy. A brotherhood bound to no nation, answerable only to God, unsettled the balance of power. Whispers in royal courts claimed that the knights bowed to an invisible master, that they guarded knowledge forbidden since the days of Babel. To the fearful, their silence became proof of blasphemy. Inside the order, contemplation replaced concern. Scholars among the brothers studied the wisdom of East and West, Greek philosophy, Arab astronomy, Hebrew mysticism. They copied manuscripts brought from Antioch and Toledo, weaving fragments of ancient thought into new understanding. For them, Solomon's legacy was not treasure, but insight. The realization that creation itself obeyed geometry, and that faith was the study of that design. Every fortress they built, every chapel they consecrated, became a verse in an unspoken psalm. Evening often found them standing upon the ramparts of the mount, gazing toward the desert where the first patriarchs once walked. Starlight traced the same paths above that their compasses marked below. In those moments, the centuries between Solomon and Christ, between prophecy and crusade, seemed to collapse into one continuous breath. The Templars were no longer merely guardians of pilgrims. They had become interpreters of the sacred pattern that bound heaven to earth. In distant Europe, storytellers turned their vigilance into myth. Some claimed the knights had discovered the Holy Grail, a vessel of divine knowledge rather than blood. Others said they guarded a book of measurements capable of rebuilding the temple. Every legend blurred history further, yet each carried a truth, that the Order's power was never merely martial, it was spiritual, and that frightened those who ruled by crown and coin. Centuries later, scholars would argue about what truly lay beneath the Temple Mount, what the knights had found, what they had become. None could say with certainty. What remains clear is the transformation. A handful of idealists who began as protectors of pilgrims evolved into an institution that shaped the mind of an age. Their silence, their symmetry, their faith in proportion, these outlasted every crusade. Night fell softly over Jerusalem as it had for millennia. Wind swept through cypress groves, carrying scents of dust and incense. Lamps flickered along the ancient colonnades. From the mount, faint chants rose in measured cadence, Latin words weaving through Arabic air. Somewhere beneath, in corridors sealed by time, the stones still remembered the hands of the first builders. Whether those hands had carved chambers of treasure or of truth no longer mattered. What mattered was the continuity, the unbroken thread from Solomon's dream to the knights who kept vigil above his buried threshold. Faith may change its symbols, but the pattern endures. Upon that mount, war and worship had traded places for centuries, yet every conqueror left the same message engraved in silence. What is divine can be destroyed in form, but never in essence. The Templars, in their quiet devotion and dangerous knowledge, had become proof of that truth. Beneath armor and oath, they were masons of memory, rebuilding in secret what time had undone. Autumn mist drifted through the streets of Paris, coiling between the stone towers of the temple fortress. Bells tolled in the grey distance. Merchants shouted near the riverbank. The city smelled of smoke and coin. Inside those walls, knights once revered across Christendom knelt in prayer, unaware that history had already turned against them. 2 centuries of triumph had ripened into suspicion. What began as reverence was curdling into fear. Rumor moved faster than truth. Stories of secret rites, of candles extinguished during oaths, of idols kissed in darkness, wound through taverns and courts. No one could prove them, yet each tale echoed something plausible. The Order's silence, its autonomy, its wealth. In France, King Philip the Fair listened closely. His debts to the temple had become chains he longed to break. To accuse the knights of heresy would not only free him from obligation, but grant him their treasure. Political cunning disguised itself as moral outrage. Faith became weapon. October dawn on the 13th day of 1307 arrived with rain. Messengers bearing sealed orders spread through the realm. At first light, soldiers pounded on the gates of every Templar house in France. Brothers who had risen for morning prayer found themselves seized, their hands bound, their archives confiscated. In Paris, entire processions of white mantles moved through the mud under guard. Citizens watched in silence as the most disciplined men in Europe were led like criminals through streets they had built and defended. Interrogations began at once. Torture rooms filled the spaces once used for storage. Under pain and fire, confessions spilled forth, each more fantastic than the last. Some spoke of denying Christ, others of worshipping a severed head named Baphomet, a name no one had heard before that hour. Such words, extracted through agony, suited the narrative Philip required. The Church, cornered by its own dependence on the Order, hesitated. Pope Clement, pressured by the crown, authorized trials to preserve unity. The same authority that had once blessed the temple now stood aside as it burned. Outside the dungeons, the world waited in disbelief. Farmers who had entrusted their harvests to Templar barns now whispered that sorcery had protected their grain. Scholars who had borrowed their manuscripts called them heretics in self-defense. The fall of the temple was swift because envy had already prepared the ground. Accusation was easier than understanding. Destruction easier than gratitude. Within the Order, bewilderment turned to endurance. In commanderies beyond France, Portugal, England, Aragon, the arrests came slower, the trials less cruel. Many local lords doubted the charges, but feared opposing the papal decree. Some brothers escaped by sea, sailing from La Rochelle under cover of night. Others vanished into sympathetic monasteries, or donned the robes of ordinary monks. Few carried gold, most carried memory. The archives of the temple, maps, ledgers, letters, and perhaps the fragments of the Mount's mystery, dispersed into hidden vaults and private hands. In Portugal, King Dinis, unwilling to condemn men who had guarded his frontiers, simply renamed them. The Order of Christ replaced the Order of the Temple, and its knights continued their work under new emblem. In their commandery at Tamar, round towers still echoed the proportions of Solomon's sanctuary. Whatever knowledge had once been guarded in Jerusalem found refuge behind Portuguese walls. From there, centuries later, ships would sail into unknown seas, guided by stars the Templars had long studied. Meanwhile, in France, the persecution reached its climax. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Order, languished in prison for 7 years, while courts debated theology and debt disguised as doctrine. In March 1314, he was led to the scaffold before Notre Dame, chains glinting in the firelight. Witnesses said he walked with calm dignity, refusing to recant. As flames rose around him, he lifted his voice above the roar. God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon he shall judge those who have condemned us. The crowd fell silent. Some claimed the Seine's wind carried his final words to the royal palace. Within a year, both Pope and King were dead. Legend called it justice. History calls it coincidence. Either way, the curse endured. Europe absorbed the shock with nervous relief. Monasteries took over Templar lands. Crowns seized their treasuries. Yet something in the story refused to die. Pilgrims still prayed in round chapels the order had built. Masons still used their measurements when raising cathedrals. Across the continent, myths multiplied. Some believed that before the arrests, ships from La Rochelle had sailed north to Scotland, carrying relics and texts forbidden to the church. Others said the order's surviving masters had fled to Portugal, embedding their symbols in stone for future generations to decipher. Wherever the knights had gone, their silence followed them, more eloquent than any confession. In distant lands, echoes of their science persisted. Builders across Europe designed towers aligned with solstice light, arches proportioned to harmonic intervals. To the untrained eye, these were beautiful. To initiates, they were remnants of the temple's secret language. Cathedrals at Rosslyn, Chartres, and Tamar seemed to hum with the same mathematics once whispered beneath Jerusalem. Each stood as monument to a brotherhood erased in name, but not in spirit. Among scholars, a different legacy took root. The writings of medieval alchemists and mystics began to merge the Templar ideal with their own philosophies. They spoke of transformation through discipline, of the union between geometry and prayer. In those coded treatises, the temple survived as symbol of inner construction, the raising of a sanctuary within the self. What had begun as stone and sword had become thought and light. In the centuries that followed, new brotherhoods rose in shadow. Some called themselves builders, others guardians, all tracing lineage to the silent order extinguished by fire. Whether true heirs or imitators, they carried forward fragments of the same dream. That divine order could be mapped, measured, and lived. The seal of Solomon reappeared in their emblems, the red cross in their chapels. Even in secrecy, the geometry of faith refused extinction. Historians now speak of the Templars as casualties of politics, bankers undone by power. Yet to those who study their architecture, their symbols, and their legends, another story remains. The order's fall did not end the pattern, it dispersed it. From that scattering came the Renaissance hunger for proportion, the birth of navigation, and the flowering of secret schools that sought wisdom in harmony rather than conquest. Their physical temple was ashes, but its blueprint had entered human imagination. In silence, survival found new shape. Across Portugal's coast, sailors watched stars with instruments that bore traces of Templar design. Across Scotland's green valleys, stonemasons carved seven-pointed roses into chapel walls. Across France, farmers still swore by the courage of the knights who never returned. Faith had turned into legend, and legend into continuity. The fire of their destruction had only refined what could not burn. As centuries passed, the curse of Jacques de Molay faded into proverb, yet his order's shadow remained. Every generation rediscovered fragments of their story, sometimes in archives, sometimes in stone, sometimes in its own longing for meaning. The temple had fallen, but its wisdom had scattered like sparks on the wind. And somewhere within that wind lingered the same whisper heard in Solomon's dream, the same vow carved into every Templar wall. The pattern is eternal. Winter settled over Europe like a long exhalation. In Paris, the charred square, where Jacques de Molay had met his death, was swept clean by snow. Travellers paused as they passed the spot, crossing themselves without knowing why. Kings believed they had erased the order of the temple from history. Priests thought the last trace of its heresy had turned to smoke. Yet beneath that silence, a pulse remained. A pattern too deeply carved into stone and spirit to vanish with its builders. Far from France, the embers glowed brighter. In Portugal, King Dinis refused to condemn men who had defended his frontiers and financed his harbours. He merely changed their name. The Ordem de Cristo, Order of Christ, inherited the properties, ships, and knowledge once held by the temple. Its red cross resembled the old emblem so closely that pilgrims who saw it upon sails whispered the Templars had never perished, only sailed under new winds. In the fortress of Tomar, circular chapels echoed with chants that no chronicler could translate. Behind thick walls, maps of stars and coastlines hung beside drawings of the Temple Mount. What had been spiritual guardianship became exploration. The compass replaced the sword. Centuries later, ships bearing that cross would push beyond the edge of known seas. Their captains studied the heavens with instruments engraved in the same ratios once used to measure chapels. They spoke of divine geometry, of harmony between navigation and prayer. When Portuguese fleets reached Africa, India, and the far islands of the West, chroniclers called it discovery. Yet to the descendants of the temple, it was continuation, a voyage toward the horizon of Solomon's wisdom, where the architecture of heaven met the surface of the sea. Northward, across mist and moor, another refuge endured. In Scotland, where papal decrees held little weight, exiled knights found shelter under lords who owed them nothing but respect. There, traditions of stonemasons and builders mingled with remnants of Templar discipline. Legends tell of brothers who traded armor for aprons, preserving their geometry in tools rather than weapons. Lodges of artisans rose near abbeys and castles, their rituals echoing those once performed on the mount. The craftsman's square replaced the warrior's blade. The temple they built was inward, measured not in cubits, but in conscience. Over generations, this quiet brotherhood of builders would claim descent from the keepers of Solomon's secret. Their stones would bear symbols older than their language, and every cathedral they raised would hum with the mathematics of faith. Across Europe, faint traces appeared in ways no authority could forbid. Cathedrals aligned to solstice light. Rose windows formed stars within circles. Altars rested upon proportions matching the Holy of Holies. Each echoed the same conviction, that sacred order survives through design. Scholars of later ages would call it coincidence. Those who listened more closely heard deliberate remembrance, geometry as prayer, architecture as continuity. In secret libraries, manuscripts attributed to the temple resurfaced. Some described celestial harmonies, others the measures of lost sanctuaries. One text, known only as Liber de Architectura Dei, spoke of the world as a great construction sustained by balance. When one stone falls, it read, another must rise, for the pattern endures. The line became motto for a scattered fraternity that refused despair. Though the church silenced their name, they answered to another master, the order of proportion itself. New movements arose beneath that lineage. Alchemists and mystics of the Renaissance borrowed Templar symbolism, cross, triangle, circle, to illustrate the transformation of matter and soul. To them, the fallen knights represented more than tragedy. They embodied the alchemist's principle that destruction is the beginning of renewal. What the fire consumed, the spirit transmuted. Artists painted faint red crosses into the corners of their canvases. Architects embedded the hexagram of Solomon into facades of new cathedrals. Every echo became testimony that knowledge once hidden had survived. Across the Mediterranean, whispers spoke of surviving masters traveling east, carrying relics and scrolls into lands where Islam and Christianity met without sword. Among Sufi orders in Syria and Anatolia, certain geometric motifs, interlaced stars, circles within squares, reappeared, resembling those found in Templar chapels. Some scholars later suspected exchange, a quiet dialogue between mystics who shared reverence for divine design beyond dogma. Whether coincidence or kinship, the symmetry of their symbols suggested that the wisdom buried under the temple had indeed crossed borders unseen. Time reshaped their legend. Poets transformed knights into seekers of an invisible grail. Philosophers turned them into custodians of universal law. Beneath embellishment, one truth remained. The temple had become idea. Kings could burn men, but not the geometry of heaven. That pattern migrated from parchment to pillar, from secret to structure. Every arch that met its twin in perfect balance, every dome that caught sunlight in harmonic rhythm, repeated the vow first made by Solomon's builders, to give form to faith. By the 15th century, the successors of the Order of Christ had funded voyages that redrew the world. Their ships mapped coasts as if extending the temple's foundations across oceans. In their wake, stonemasons built round towers along the Atlantic rim, silent in purpose but precise in form. Even in the New World, explorers carved crosses within circles on fort walls, marks that echoed the seal of Jerusalem. The age of crusades had ended, yet the crusade of knowledge had begun. In Europe, reformations shattered Christendom's unity, and wars of faith turned cathedrals into fortresses. Amid the noise, small brotherhoods kept older wisdom alive under veils of allegory. They met in cellars, cloisters, and stone lodges, invoking Solomon not as monarch but as archetype of understanding. Their rituals honored the builder's craft and the seeker's path, the fusion of hands and spirit. In their oaths survived the discipline of the Templars, the silence of the Mount, the conviction that enlightenment required architecture both outer and inner. Centuries blurred into legend. Historians dismissed the lineage. Dreamers revived it. Somewhere between fact and faith, the Templars became what they had always pursued, symbol. In paintings, they stood as defenders of lost wisdom. In secret societies, as prototypes of moral order. In the imagination of the West, as proof that knowledge once sanctified can never truly be destroyed. The fire of the 1307 had scattered them like sparks across time. Each generation that rekindled curiosity became their descendant. Toward the end of the Renaissance, thinkers from Florence to Edinburgh began to speak of the universe as a grand temple, its laws mathematical, its beauty divine. Astronomers mapped these heavens with the same reverence masons once reserved for sanctuary walls. The boundary between science and faith blurred into wonder. Behind those discoveries, unseen yet unmistakable, lay the echo of the temple's teaching, that creation and comprehension are twin acts, and that to measure the world is to praise it. Even now, the pattern endures. Travelers who walk the ruins of Jerusalem feel it in the wind through the stones. Architects who draw perfect arcs unknowingly repeat equations whispered by long-dead brothers. Sailors who navigate by stars trace the same geometry once carved on Templar compasses. Across centuries, across continents, the silence left by the order still vibrates beneath the noise of history. Fire can erase names, but not meaning. The temple fell, the brotherhood burned, yet its designs survived in everything humanity built afterward. In bridges, in cathedrals, in the quiet certainty that order underlies chaos. From Solomon's dream to the ashes of the pyres, a single thought has never died, that heaven has a structure, and those who remember its measure carry eternity in their hands. Morning light spilled across the Atlantic, gilding the sails that bore the red cross of Christ. Ships once guided by swords now carried compasses, astrolabes, and charts inked with celestial geometry. To the world, they were explorers. To those who remembered, they were heirs. The age of crusades had ended, yet the crusade of understanding had just begun. What the fire of persecution had scattered across continents was quietly gathering again, not in fortresses or monasteries, but in the minds of builders, thinkers, and seekers who carried fragments of an ancient design. In Lisbon's docks, sailors whispered that the Order of Christ still kept watch over voyages, steering them by stars that once shone above Jerusalem. Their captains prayed in round chapels, modelled after the Temple Mount, where stone echoed with hymns in languages older than empire. They believed discovery itself was devotion, that every new horizon expanded creation's cathedral. When caravels traced lines across uncharted waters, their routes resembled the lattice of sacred geometry, a map drawn not merely upon the ocean, but upon eternity. In this way, Solomon's dream extended beyond sand and cedar to the blue depths of the unknown. Far to the north, Scotland's valleys held another continuation. Among stonemasons who raised abbeys and bridges, remnants of the Templar craft endured. Apprentices learned not only how to shape stone, but how to read proportion as scripture. Their lodges, humble by appearance, mirrored the order of the heavens in their rituals. Compass, square, and level became relics of a moral architecture, reminders that the true temple was built within conscience. Over centuries, these lodges evolved into communities of builders whose secrets were not of war, but of wisdom. From their gatherings emerged a philosophy that honored labor, balance, and the hidden harmony of the world. The philosophy that would one day be called Freemasonry. Within this new brotherhood, the story of Solomon's Temple found rebirth. No longer a fortress of faith or a monument of kingship, it became an allegory of enlightenment. Every initiate represented the builder who sought perfection through discipline. The unfinished temple stood as symbol of the human soul, an edifice still under construction, awaiting the light that enters when understanding replaces fear. Rituals once whispered under threat of flame, now unfolded openly in candlelit halls across Europe. Geometry, proportion, and moral law fused into one craft. Stone had given way to spirit, but the pattern remained unchanged. Renaissance scholars, fascinated by the marriage of art and number, rediscovered the divine ratios buried in ancient texts. Architects like Brunelleschi and Alberti designed churches whose vaults followed the same mathematics the Templars had guarded. Artists painted halos as golden circles measured by harmonic intervals. Even in secular courts, the notion spread that beauty itself was proof of divine order. Knowledge that had once hidden beneath the Temple Mount now shone through fresco and facade. What had been persecuted as heresy returned as genius. In Florence, philosophers spoke of man as microcosm, the living reflection of creation's symmetry. In their dialogues echoed the same wisdom that Solomon had asked of God, understanding of the heart. Meanwhile, mathematicians traced the orbit of planets and saw in their motion the same architecture that governed cathedrals. Science, long divorced from sanctity, rediscovered reverence through precision. The line between temple and laboratory dissolved. The pursuit of proportion became a kind of prayer. Humanity had learned to read the universe as scripture written in the language of number. Across the Alps, secret societies formed that claimed descent from the ancient builders. Their members gathered in candlelight to study geometry, astronomy, and the moral art of measurement. They spoke of rebuilding the temple, not in Jerusalem, but in human conduct, through charity, knowledge, and equilibrium. In their lodges, the tools of the mason turned symbolic, the square for virtue, the compass for restraint, the plumb for conscience. Each initiation reenacted the labor of creation itself. When the candidate emerged from darkness into light, it was not merely ceremony, it was the reenactment of Genesis. The Enlightenment carried these ideals into the heart of politics. Philosophers and revolutionaries alike invoked the temple as metaphor for a just society, one measured by reason and symmetry rather than bloodline. Capitals were planned with geometric precision. Monuments rose as modern cathedrals of civility. Even nations began to see themselves as architectures of order. The red cross of the Crusader faded, replaced by compasses and stars. Yet in every design, visible or hidden, lingered the echo of Solomon's pattern, the conviction that structure itself could express truth. Across the Atlantic, new lands offered new foundations. Builders who crossed the ocean carried with them the symbols of their craft, compasses etched into cornerstones, cornerstones aligned to the rising sun. Cities planned upon grids mirrored the same yearning for balance that had once inspired the temple's courts. In their civic buildings and public squares, geometry served morality. The concept of the sacred had expanded to encompass liberty itself, the freedom to build, to think, to create. What had begun as revelation in stone now breathed through constitutions and classrooms. Meanwhile, mystics and artists in Europe reimagined the lost temple through metaphor and myth. Rosicrucians spoke of a house of the spirit, a palace invisible to the uninitiated. Alchemists described the philosophical stone as the cornerstone rejected by ignorance. Poets wrote of a city within the soul, walled not by marble but by understanding. Even scientists, Kepler, Newton, Leibniz, searched for divine architecture in mathematics, convinced that every orbit and proportion reflected the mind of God. The wisdom once sealed beneath the mount had escaped containment, flowing into every discipline that sought harmony between creation and creator. Centuries turned, and memory softened into symbol. The temple became a mirror in which each age saw its own ideals. For theologians, it signified covenant. For philosophers, reason. For masons, conscience. For artists, perfection. Yet beneath these layers, the same current moved. The pursuit of unity through proportion, of spirit through structure. Humanity, in rebuilding itself, had become the latest iteration of the eternal project begun by Solomon. The architecture of heaven translated into human form. In Jerusalem, conquerors continued to come and go, yet the mount remained inviolate in its mystery. Stones once drenched in blood now lay beneath marble and prayer. Pilgrims of every faith stood upon the same ground, unaware that their feet traced circles drawn by hands long vanished. Each whispered to the same sky, seeking what every builder had sought before them, a glimpse of order behind the veil of chaos. The city endured not as possession, but as symbol of the human condition, divided, sacred, and indestructible. Modern eyes, gazing upon those stones, see archaeology where earlier generations saw revelation. Yet even science, for all its skepticism, cannot escape wonder. The patterns of particle and galaxy follow the same ratios once carved into the temple walls. The harmony Solomon dreamed has proved not superstition, but physics. The old language of geometry has simply changed its instruments. Architects still draw by compass. Astronomers still measure the heavens. Between them persists the bridge the Templars once vowed to guard, the connection between mind and cosmos, between measure and meaning. Across centuries, symbols of the temple persist in plain sight. Cathedrals built by medieval hands align with solstice light. City grids echo sacred proportion. Even digital circuits trace binary rhythms that mirror Pythagorean harmony. Humanity continues to build temples without knowing it. Every act of creation, every search for pattern, repeats the same longing to give structure to the invisible. The old question has never changed: how to make the finite worthy of the infinite. In this enduring pursuit, the line between myth and memory blurs. Solomon's dream, the exile's lament, the Crusader's vow, the Templars' silence, all converge into one story: the quest to rebuild what was lost, not in stone, but in spirit. The temple that burned became the idea of rebuilding itself. Every generation, in art or science or faith, adds another course of stone to that invisible structure. The project is endless, as creation is endless. At the threshold of the modern world, the temple still stands, no longer confined to Jerusalem or any single creed, but scattered across minds and monuments. Its fire burns in laboratories, in libraries, in the quiet persistence of those who seek pattern over power. The ark that vanished became conscience. The vault that collapsed became curiosity. Humanity, in searching for meaning, has rebuilt the sanctuary it once lost. Evening light over the holy city glows bronze against domes and spires. Wind moves through olive trees as it did in Solomon's time, carrying the scent of dust, prayer, and memory. Beneath the mount, layers of history press against one another. Canaanite rock, Herodian brick, Byzantine marble, Ottoman tile. Above, 1,000 voices rise in different tongues, yet share the same intent: to reach the unseen through what can be built, sung, or measured. The pattern endures, waiting to be recognized anew. In every act of creation, whether temple, poem, or theory, the human spirit reenacts the same revelation. To build is to remember. To measure is to believe. The wisdom that once descended as fire now travels as light, carried not in arcs or vaults, but in thought itself. And somewhere within that light still lingers the whisper heard by a young king in a dream long ago: "Ask what I shall give you." The answer, written across millennia of stone and sky, remains unchanged. Wisdom is the gift, the temple is the task, and the pattern, the silent geometry linking heaven and earth, endures within all who seek to understand.